Good evening, everybody. Our top stories tonight. Whatever happened to the Monroe Doctrine? Our government today focusing on the challenge of Russian and Chinese influence in Africa, ignoring the more proximate threat posed by the two authoritarian states as they encroach upon the American theater of influence, the Western Hemisphere. It's long been the clear region of U.S. influence and clear dominance, politically, economically, and when necessary, militarily. Tonight, we examine the little reported and even less discussed geopolitical axis that has formed over the past half-decade and which is now directly in opposition to U.S. interest in America's historical sphere of unrivaled influence, that is, North and South America, and surrounding seas and oceans. Russia and China have quietly merged and energized elements of their respective foreign policies that first insinuates both countries into this hemisphere, and second, establishes new relationships to directly challenge U.S. policies and interests. Russia in league with Venezuela, China partnering with Panama, a strengthening challenge to the world's only superpower, and a challenge that can no longer be ignored without paying a heavy price. We take up the rising possibility of confrontation between the United States and China and Russia in this hemisphere. Gordon Chang joining us tonight. Also tonight, President Trump continues his fight for American business and consumers, demanding an end to China's unfair trade practices and theft of U.S. technology and intellectual property.
We cannot continue to lose $500 billion a year to China. And I had a fantastic meeting with President Xi. This was a 4-hour meeting where everything was agreed on. Now, if we get it down in paper, that'll be another story, but I think we will. We have great strength. Nobody's ever done what I've done. I said, look, we're going to tax all of your product. And by the way, if you saw the study that just came out, America is paying for 4%, and China is paying for 21%.
I'll discuss the Trump administration's efforts to end China's mercantilist trade policies. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross joins us here tonight. And the Mueller witch hunt, expanding. That's right, expanding. Mueller struck out on collusion. Now he's intent upon gratuitous harassment of the Trump presidency as he wants to investigate Middle Eastern efforts to influence American politics. President Trump fighting back against what is clearly the most politically and morally corrupt persecution of any president in history.
Nobody, except for me, would be looked at like this. Nobody. What about Congress, where they have a slush fund and millions of dollars is paid out each year? They have a slush fund. Millions. They don't talk about campaign finance or anything. Have you ever heard of campaign finance list? Have they listed that on their campaign finance sheets? No.
And we take up Mueller's ever-expanding, never-ending witch hunt. Washington Times opinion editor Charlie Hurt and RNC committeewoman and attorney Harmeet Dillon among our guests. Our top story, China and Russia moving rapidly to insinuate and quickly broaden their influence in this hemisphere, as our national security leaders seem publicly to lament their encroachment and expansionary foreign policies elsewhere in the world, whether the Middle East or Africa, while China and Russia challenge U.S. influence here in this hemisphere. In Venezuela, Russian nuclear-capable bombers capable of carrying nuclear missiles carried out a 10-hour training exercise with the Venezuelan Air Force over the Caribbean Sea. The exercise comes as the Chinese investments in Central America, winning contracts, for example, in Panama and in Ecuador, among other nations, building ports, convention centers, bridges over the Panama Canal. China taking effective control of that canal, establishing debt traps across the region for economically struggling small Central and South American nations. Why are our intelligence agencies, the State Department, the Defense Department, the President's National Security Council, seemingly ignoring all of these developments, at least publicly? There's nothing new about China's rising belligerence and direct threat to U.S. interest. The Department of Justice just issued a report finding more than 90% of federal economic espionage cases are linked to one nation, and that is China. And over 2/3 of the DOJ's theft of trade secrets in this report linked to, again, China. So how is the Pentagon defending against the Chinese and the Russian flexing of muscle in this hemisphere? Certainly not by military deployment. Just to put this in some context, we have about 200,000 troops deployed around the globe, fewer than 2,000 of them in Central and South America. Joining me now, Gordon Chang, columnist, attorney, author of the book, The Coming Collapse of China, the book, The Nuclear Showdown. Gordon spent almost 2 decades working in Shanghai and Hong Kong. Great to have you with us. Gordon, now let's start with first the Africa Prosperity, this initiative enunciated by John Bolton, the president's national security advisor. It seems it couldn't have been more poorly timed or more poorly placed than Africa, for crying out loud.
Yeah, it's poorly executed as well because it's unresourced. You know, Bolton has said to African nations, look, you got to choose between China and Russia on one side or the United States on the other. Well, with China dumping so much money in there, that's an easy question for those countries. We're going to lose that one. If we're going to challenge the Chinese and Russians in Africa, let's at least do it in a way that we can prevail. But as you point out, look, we've got other priorities right now, and that's certainly much closer to home because you have the Russians cooperating with the Venezuelans. You have the Chinese putting Venezuela into a debt trap. And so clearly you have both Moscow and Beijing challenging us just miles from our borders.
And without apparent response. This is a curious, if you will, bifurcation of interest, U.S. interest, to suddenly focus on Africa, where the Chinese have for the past at least decade and a half been investing, buying and controlling commodities, and whether it be rare earth, whether it be metals, whatever it may be. They have such an advance in the region of the African continent that it's unimaginable that there would not be a strategy and, as you say, resources articulated by the administration if they're going to come up with some sort of African initiative.
You know, the most important thing right now in terms of our security is what's happening on our southern border, because you have all of these people leaving their countries. And the reason why is because those countries are doing very poorly. And this is going to be a continuing problem. But, you know, the United States, administration in and administration out, have really just neglected Latin America. You can think back only until Grenada in the Reagan administration, when it was at the top of our foreign policy priorities.
And Panama, which we invaded, of course, and it took, anyway, to look back on it is unhelpful, I suppose, at this point, because we have watched president after president ignore what is an appropriate strategic response, it would seem, at least to me, rather than investing trillions of dollars. And now, by the way, the clever U.S. multinationals are understanding it's time to move out of China because that promise is not going to be fulfilled. Even the denizens of corporate America are starting to awaken. But they also lost the opportunity of investing in South America, Central America, and building up this region and creating markets. It is the most, and it has been going on, and by the way, I'm not saying this now, I've been saying it for 20 years. This is just wrong-headedness driven by divided loyalties among U.S. multinationals.
When you go back millennia, countries do one thing, they secure their borders. They do that first before they do other things. We're sort of like the opposite.
Oh, yeah, we're much too clever to be smart. You know.
Yeah, and you think about it, November 2013, John Kerry, Secretary of State, says, look, we're abandoning the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is...
It was a great November when he did that.
This is the doctrine that the United States says we're opposing colonialism in our region. Now, why would we want free and independent countries in our regions to be colonies of foreign powers? I just don't get it.
Yeah, we're beyond now colonization. We're talking now about two world powers that are now in this hemisphere, and they're staying. It's pretty clear. There has not been so much as a riposte in the most subtle, nuanced, even vague way on the part of the United States to their initiative to assert their influence and direct opposition to the United States in this hemisphere. What are we to do?
Yeah, well, I think that what we first of all got to do is have some leadership on the part of the White House to make sure that multinationals understand the importance of investing in our own region. I think President Trump has done something like that by trying to get the supply chains out of China. If we can get them out of China, we can get them into our region. We can then tie their economies more closely to ours. Then I think a number of these problems go away.
That often escapes the attention of the national left-wing media, that the president's policy of balanced trade, reciprocal trade, fair trade is already driving U.S. multinationals who had invested in plant and offshoring in China. Those supply chains are moving rather quickly to Vietnam and to other southeastern nations. As to Russian nuclear-capable bombers, two of them in this instance, in Venezuela. We know that the Iranians also have interest in Venezuela. We also know that Ecuador is a victim of a Chinese debt trap that is now come due. And that they've taken effective control of the canal. They're dominating Panama without any question whatsoever. The U.S. response in terms of the military presence of Russia, what should it be?
Well, you know, we go back to 1962 and what the Kennedy administration did during the missile crisis. You know, in Cuba, you have a number of installations which once were Soviet, maybe now Russian. There's some hints that the Chinese are coming back into Cuba, you know, with listening to our phone conversation in traffic.
Yeah, by the way, there's not been a single public response to those embassy personnel who were hit by some sort of sonic weapon, and many of whom had debilitating consequences, who are still injured as a result.
And because we didn't do anything about the sonic attacks on our diplomats in Cuba, the Chinese have now done it in Guangzhou against us. And so this thing is spreading.
Gordon Chang, thanks so much. It is time, perhaps, for the American people to be alert to the threats, whether it be an invasion of a caravan of Central American migrants, whether it be the presence of nuclear-capable bombers, Russian bombers in our hemisphere, or a China that fully means to dominate not just its natural hegemonic sphere of influence, but the whole world.
Colonize is the word. Yeah. China's colonization of Latin America.
Well, and whatever you call it, it is a contest that it is becoming extraordinarily more critical every day. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Lou.
Up next here, after 2 years of a never-ending assault on his character, on his person, on his policies, the president has decided to spend Christmas with his family. And to hell with the national left-wing media. We'll take that up and more right after this quick break. Ed Rollins joins us. Stay with us. Good for the president. He's canceled this year's White House Christmas party for members of the media. The president and his administration have endured relentless attacks and will forevermore from all the left-wing news organizations, the left-wing media. The White House says it will arrange tours, however, for members of the media who wish to see the White House. This is my favorite line of all. The White House holiday decor. Oh, my goodness. Former President Obama's ego trip, which is never ending, took something of a stop in New York City last night. He accepted the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award. You know he would. And then he proceeded to talk about, you're not going to be surprised, himself.
I miss Ethel tonight. That's my girl. And I'd also like to congratulate tonight's other honorees. My former ambassador to Germany, Governor Phil Murphy. I love you too. I'm not sure if you've heard, but I've been on this hope kick for a while now. I gave a big speech on hope. I ran a couple of campaigns. Hope. It's my kind of thing. Somebody made a poster of me with hope. So I'd like to thank all of you for officially validating my hope credentials. I have seen it. I have lived it. So, if it is okay with you, I, for one, am going to be sticking with hope.
have to tell you, that's an impressive performance, even by any narcissistic standard. The most divisive president in modern American history went on then to say, many people now doubt the very notion of common ground in our political discourse. I'm sure you know a couple, but he's always, well, so hopeful. New Fox poll numbers show strong Republican support for President Trump. Are you ready? 88% of Republican voters approve of the job President Trump is doing in Washington. Joining me now, former Reagan White House political director, Fox Business political analyst Ed Rollins, and the dean of political strategists in this country with us. What do you think of the idea? I'm tempted to ask you about Obama, but let's not.
He was hopeful that his successor was going to be Mrs. Clinton, too, and that didn't work out quite so well.
Yeah, but he's going to stick with hope.
Right.
I don't think he could have overworked that word a bit. Let's turn to this, the very idea that we're going to ignore what the Chinese and the Russians are doing in this hemisphere, and we're going to suddenly, as Ambassador Bolton, the National Security Advisor, said today, we're going to talk about Africa prosper. It's some sort of initiative that I can't, frankly, fathom at all when you've got extant and proximate threats to the national interest.
Well, the bottom line is we're never going to compete with China in Africa, and we need to compete with everybody here in this hemisphere and do everything we can to make this hemisphere stronger with our investments and with our military and what have you, and we have to protect ourselves. President Reagan did that. President Kennedy did that.
So how does an administration end up with neither a defense secretary, a State Department state secretary, a national security advisor focused on what is happening at the border? The president is talking about it every day. He's focusing on the southern border and the threats, whether it's drugs, whether it's terrorists, whether it's the Chinese coming up for a visit from the Panama Canal, or the Russians and the Iranians in Venezuela, or I mean, it goes on and on.
Our neighbors are very susceptible, and the threat is very high. So I think, from our perspective, if we don't focus on it now, we're going to be focused on it big time in a very short period of time. Let's rebuild this hemisphere. Let's focus on the border. Let's basically get border control there, and then we can go help some of these countries below us and make them trading partners and what have you in this hemisphere.
This president has done so many positive, powerful things in his first 2 years in office, but none, in my opinion, more powerful than calling upon the world community to balance free, fair, reciprocal trade, to balance trade relationships around the globe. The European Union has now, God bless them, stood up and demanded that of the Chinese. This president is beginning to develop allies for his world view and for his perspective and for his philosophy and the Trump doctrine. This is a big moment in time.
It is, and what we should never underestimate is that China is still a communist country. It is the largest, by far, communist country. And there's some susceptibility to that philosophy in some of these Latin and South American countries. Socialism, which is another version. So I think we have to be really focused front and center. It's good for us. It's good for them long term. And we basically need to have our military here close to home protecting our borders.
And meanwhile, the morons in the Republican leadership in the House have got a vote scheduled for Wednesday when they return. They're just about out of time. And there is now great debate that the Republicans don't even have the votes for the border wall, that they will be voting on that Wednesday evening. And they're certainly not going to have the votes in the Senate, as the president pointed out to Pelosi, Schumer. This is one of the most pathetic possible conclusions to the Republican control of the House and the Senate.
I would still, as a Republican, make them all stand up and sign their name on the, raise their right hand and say yes, and those who don't, basically let us know who they are. Do it once and for all.
Yeah, I think right now, if you got an R next to your name and you're on Capitol Hill, you're highly suspect in the minds and hearts of most Americans.
Well,
good to have you here, Ed. Thanks so much. Be sure to vote on our poll tonight. The question is, do you believe the Trump national security team should be paying far more attention to Russian and Chinese encroachment in this hemisphere and asserting the Monroe Doctrine? Cast your vote on Twitter at Lou Dobbs. We'd like to hear from you. Follow me on Twitter at Lou Dobbs. Like me on Facebook. Follow me on Instagram at Lou Dobbs Tonight. Up next, a rarity we want to share with you. Radical Dem leader Nancy Pelosi speaking truth.
I wish that the press would spend a lot more time on what we need to do here to meet the needs of the American people instead of morning, noon, and night allegations against the president.
Wow. There's hope yet. Thank you, Mr. Obama. We take up the latest in the Mueller witch hunt. Charlie Hurt, Harmeet Dillon join me right after these quick messages. Now investigating President Trump's inaugural committee. Prosecutors, 2 years later, looking into whether the committee misspent some of the $107 million raised from donations and whether donors gave money in exchange for influence in the incoming Trump administration. White House spokesperson Sarah Sanders says the investigation has nothing to do with the president or the first lady. Apparently it was just the best that another set of left-wing federal prosecutors could come up with to persecute the president. Well, according to a new report, Special Counsel Robert Mueller is preparing to reveal how the Middle East interfered in the 2016 presidential election. Mueller reportedly will show how some Middle Eastern countries, namely the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, all tried to interfere in 2016 and later attempt to exert influence over the Trump administration. Wow, we've come a long way from collusion, haven't we? By the way, I should point out that Mueller has yet to provide a scintilla of evidence or even the prospect of a scintilla of evidence, a scant suggestion of any evidence of Trump-Russia collusion whatsoever. But now you're going to get to hear about the Middle East, apparently. Joining us tonight, Harmeet Dillon, the Dillon Law Group managing partner, board member of the Republican National Lawyers Association, RNC, committeewoman for the great state of California, and Charlie Hurt, Washington Times opinion editor, Fox Business contributor. Thank you both for being here.
Good to be with you, Lou.
Harmeet, let me, if I may, start with you. You're the attorney. It looks like that a band of left-wing radical Dems who happen to be prosecutors in Manhattan, the Southern District of New York, the Attorney General of the state of New York, and of course Robert Mueller and the DOJ, and combined with the deep state, are doing everything they can to persecute this president. When in the world will somebody step up and stop it?
Well, maybe when we have a new Attorney General in place, hopefully very soon, he has the authority to certainly stop the Southern District of New York from its witch hunt, but he doesn't really have the authority to stop the New York Attorney General from doing so. And so we may have to see something happen in the courts with refusal to comply with things based on executive privilege and so forth. But, Lou, to your point, there seems to be no longer any pretense of objectivity here. Clearly, we have prosecutors running wild, simply looking for crimes to pin on the president because they don't like him. It's very clear, and it's disgusting.
What do you, Charlie, what do you think? Maybe a countersuit, abuse of power, go after all of them? I mean, this is crazy what we're watching, and I don't want to hear any nonsense from the left about, well, we've got to let this thing work its way through to a conclusion. We have gone well past the conclusion. There's no damn evidence. Get out of town, Mueller.
Yeah, well, I think the short answer is that they're never going to stop. And the reason they're never going to stop is that Donald Trump presents an absolute existential threat to everything the way this town works and the way this town operates. And obviously there's no evidence whatsoever that the inaugural committee has been under Donald Trump was bought off or anybody paid access to be a part of it. But it's a little bit like the scene in Casablanca when the detectives' winnings are provided. My goodness, people have been paying for access in this town since the beginning of lobbying.
Yeah, corporate America. There is no doubt that corporate America would be escorted out of town in handcuffs and doing perp walks because that's all they do is spend money to buy influence.
Right. Exactly. It's all they've ever done. And so suddenly, finally, you get some crook, some terrible lawyer, but like Michael Cohen, and some emails or some recorded conversations between him and somebody else, and they want to make a federal case out of this, which is fine. You know, get to the bottom of it, whatever. But I mean, you know, the bottom line, you know, the fact remains, you still have in a guy like Mike Cohen. By the way, how is this guy still a lawyer? I don't understand. You know, the president makes a very good point about this.
Because he meets all the standards of conduct according to the ABA.
He will lose his license now that he's pled guilty to these crimes.
Well, he definitely,
because yes,
he should.
Well, they didn't move too quickly on that.
And at the very least, he provided terrible advice to his client, because by his own admission, in the way he handled this, it was an absolute violation of everything he was supposed to be doing for the president.
Very quickly,
taping your clients is yes, that's enough, right?
Very quickly, we've got all of the folks in the FBI corrupt, politically corrupt. We have got just a legion of evildoers that have been exposed primarily as a result of the House Intelligence Committee. Some credit goes as well to the Office of the Inspector General at the Department of Justice. And there's not a single solitary soul. Whatever happened to consequences for Fusion GPS, for Christopher Steele, the author of the fraudulent Trump dossier, the collusion with the DNC and the Hillary campaign? Harmeet, where are the consequences for being insidious and awful and a lawbreaker?
Lou, the dirty secret here is that at the beginning of this administration, advisors to the president gave him very, very bad legal advice about the lawyers to hire around him, including in the Department of Justice and otherwise. And the DOJ was stacked with people who were adverse to the president. And I mean, even people like George Conway, by the way, who's one of the most virulent critics of the president on Twitter, was somebody who people in the White House advised the president to hire as one of the assistant attorney generals. So that's what happened. And once you put those people in place, unfortunately, the president can't intervene in this investigation and fire them without risking obstruction of justice. And so that's really what happened. And they keep merrily moving on. I mean, Ron Rosenstein should have, out of, kind of decency, resigned himself, but he didn't.
We'll end it with the pertinent question then. Why hasn't the president declassified all of those documents? And why hasn't he fired the corrupt fools in the U.S. Justice Department? With that, I say, Charlie, I'm sorry we're out of time, partner. We'll continue it. How's that?
Sounds good.
Charlie Hurt and Harmeet Dillon. Thank you both. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Up next, President Trump points out the Paris Climate Accord isn't working out so well for the folks in Paris, which is pretty bad if you've got an accord and you name it after Paris. We'll take that up and much more when we continue. Stay with us. Socialist left-wing French leader Emmanuel Macron surviving a no-confidence vote today with just 70 out of 577 lawmakers voting against him because he's done such a bang-up job for the French. The decision comes days after Macron announced a delay in planned tax fuel increases that have, well, sparked riots all across France. President Trump weighing in today on Macron's political crisis of his own making.
The Paris Accord is not working out too well for Paris. Because of the Paris Accord, that whole country is burning down.
You can't put it any plainer than that. Joining me now, Niger Innes, national spokesperson for the Congress on Racial Equality. Good to have you with us. And Tammy Bruce, Washington Times columnist, Fox Business contributor. Good to have you with us. Very quickly, what happened to the Paris Accord? And by the way, that looks really bad for the environment to watch all of those burning cars.
I'll tell you, that smoke, it's awful, all those tires burning. Niger and I were both laughing because I love the president. I love that man. It's hysterical, and he's absolutely correct. It's not looking too good for Paris, the Paris Accord. He warned Macron. He was mocked for warning him and the rest of the Europeans about the negative impact of the Paris Accord. He was doing it so that we would not be drawn into that maelstrom. He was doing it because he knew what would happen to fuel prices for anyone who was engaged in it. It's not like
also what would happen to their economies.
And their economies, clearly. And now, of course, they're having to deal with that. I think that for the world, of course, we have an interest in Europe growing up and realizing that this is not the way to behave. At the same time, the way that they can do that is to take Donald Trump seriously, to follow his advice, and to move forward in the direction that this country is moving forward in to save the collection of those nations.
Niger, there you have it. What do you think of the Paris Accords? Are you going to be for them tonight?
No, I don't think so, Lou. I've been in opposition to what we call the most regressive tax. It is a tax, a de facto tax on the poorest, most vulnerable populations in any society, be it in France or be it here in the United States. The uber rich can deal with these kind of de facto fuel taxes. But small businesses that want to develop, entrepreneurs that want to build a business, and just working class folk are rebelling against it. It's a populist revolt, and thank God. Viva la France!
Viva la France!
French fries!
Would be saying that. The French people are reacting, and the middle class, as well as teachers, professionals. It is a society-wide revolt, except, of course, for the elites who still think they know best. But the French president and the U.S. president there couldn't be a much more stark difference between two leaders, unless you go north to Canada and Justin Trudeau. There's a pretty stark difference there as well. This president today talking about trade with China, and the national left-wing media, the business press, none are really being as effusive and, in my opinion, plauditory as they should toward the president. This is a president who is actually succeeding in moving China and the rest of the world, including the European Union, to balanced, reciprocal, fair trade. And Tammy, he deserves great credit for that.
Well, he does. And this is where I think for the American people, when we talk about, even forget about the phrase fake news, but about just wanting to get real reports about the nature of what's happening in the world, in order to be able to do that, you will be, in fact, praising Donald Trump, because the good news in the world is coming from his leadership and his influence. But it's a choice to not cover that, because it'll make the president look good.
And it's a choice to send every left-wing prosecutor in the state, federal prosecution system right after this president and his administration. We'll find out what's going on and what can be done about it. We'll hear more from Niger and Tammy in just a second. Stay with us. We'll be right back. On Wall Street today, stocks closed mixed. The Dow gaining 70 points. The S&P lost a point. The Nasdaq down 28. Volume on the big board slipping down a little bit to 3.8 billion shares. Oil up just over 0.5%. Gold, silver, copper relatively flat. They actually trade that way all the time, it seems. Earlier today, President Trump talked about any future Fed interest rate hike, and he wasn't pleased at the prospect.
You look at inflation, it's very low. Hopefully the Fed won't be raising interest rates anymore, because if you compare us to, as an example, President Obama, he had zero interest rates. Anybody can make money with zero interest rates.
And a reminder, listen to my reports 3 times a day, coast to coast on the Salem Radio Network. President Trump addressing trade talks, intellectual property theft, stealing our technology, signs that the Chinese economy is weakening, and why?
China's economy, if it's in trouble, it's only in trouble because of me. That's the only reason it's in trouble, because I've placed billions and billions. We've taken in $11 billion worth of taxes that I taxed China. $11 billion. We never made any money with China. We lost money with China. In the last 4 months, we've taken in almost $11 billion of taxes. Nobody's ever heard of that. Nobody knows that. People don't report on that. They only report on nonsense. Nobody ever went to China and said, listen, you're stealing our intellectual property. You're doing all sorts of things that are wrong. You're taking out of our country $500 billion a year, not trillion, not million. You're taking away $500 billion away. You can't do it.
And we're back now with Niger Ennis, Tammy Bruce, and Charlie Hurt also back with us. And thank you all for staying with us as we take up the Mueller witch hunt. And Tammy, I want to go back to this Manhattan prosecution, now investigation of the inaugural committee, for crying out loud. It's just one thing after another, and on it goes.
Yeah, and it's clear, and I've said from the start also, it's been obviously these are political prosecutions per se. And when Mueller took it on, it was him agreeing to play a part in the politics of this. So he didn't take it on as this, some important political...
But he doesn't have the decency to call it when it's obvious the conclusion is no, I repeat, no collusion.
Because that wasn't the point. The point was to damage the president, and that was just simply the unlocked door. So with what New York is
should
doing...
he fire him?
Well...
then why not fire him?
But, the Attorney General, the acting Attorney General and the new one, can slow down and even not approve of subpoenas. There's a lot of things that they can do.
Let's do it straight up. Let's just fire him.
Well,
because he's a sorry son of a gun. If it's all politics, let's show him politics.
There's a lot of politics that can be done. I think that it was short of doing more damage to the president. It can be done in a certain way that the American people will appreciate. And it's also politics coming out of New York. But it must be confronted as such so the American people realize that this is not fair to any of us, let alone to the president.
I think the American people have got that message pretty loud and clear, Tammy. Niger, your thoughts? Can we fire him? Please, can we fire him?
I actually agree with Tammy on this. I think that the new Attorney General
I'm going to have to go to Charlie right now.
give a deadline to this guy. Tell him that, you got to do what or get off of the pot. You've got to reveal the goods. After the millions of dollars, after the petty indictments, it's time to show the goods on collusion. Where is the beef? There is no beef.
Well, then, let me turn to you, Charlie. I know this is my last desperate effort here.
Well, you also already know the answer.
I do know the answer. So I'm going to go straight to, what the heck? We're going to find out that the Middle East wanted to influence a presidential election? So did every country,
on the planet.
On the planet. Thank you.
My goodness.
Getting me through that.
I mean that we have a news organization in this country called Russia Today. It's the entire thing is Russian propaganda. Now I don't like the idea. I don't like anything about them. But the fact of the matter remains, as long as you have a free society, you're going to have foreign countries trying to influence elections. And nobody got upset about it until now.
But Mueller's got a whole operation devoted to it now. I mean, now we can find out exactly what the Emirates really think about. Come on. If we're going to talk, the vice president said it very well. Most of Wall Street and corporate America, the Business Roundtable, the Koch brothers, the Chamber of Commerce, they're all unregistered foreign agents lobbying against the president's policies on international trade, trying to not have tariffs. China.
Heck, while we're at it, the entire federal government is doing everything they can to undermine what this president is trying to do. And I do think, obviously, we've talked about this before. I think he should have fired him a long time ago. But I do appreciate what Tammy and Niger are pointing out, which is that it would be truly throwing diesel fuel onto a fire to do that, especially at this point, and it would lead to all sorts of political headaches. But I do think that in the meantime, I have enjoyed watching the number of things that Mueller brings back that has nothing to do with collusion, or it busts Democrats and the collusion that their hands are completely dirty with. And so, it's sort of amusing to watch all that.
Yeah, the new Attorney General can put some parameters around him as well.
New Attorney Generals all the time. I'm telling you, it's always somebody or something else. Just fire them. Niger Ennis, Tammy Bruce, Charlie Hurt, thanks so much. Coming up here next, we're going to hear from the man himself on trade, Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of the Department of Commerce, on what is going on with the Chinese talks on trade. We'll have the very latest for you from the man himself, Wilbur Ross, next. Stay with us. On Wall Street today, stocks closed mixed. The Dow gaining 70 points. The S&P lost a point. The Nasdaq down 28. Volume on the big board slipping down a little bit to 3.8 billion shares. Oil up just over 0.5%. Gold, silver, copper relatively flat. They actually trade that way all the time, it seems. Earlier today, President Trump talked about any future Fed interest rate hike, and he wasn't pleased at the prospect.
You look at inflation, it's very low. Hopefully the Fed won't be raising interest rates anymore, because if you compare us to, as an example, President Obama, he had zero interest rates. Anybody can make money with zero interest rates.
And a reminder, listen to my reports 3 times a day, coast to coast on the Salem Radio Network. President Trump addressing trade talks, intellectual property theft, stealing our technology, signs that the Chinese economy is weakening, and why?
China's economy, if it's in trouble, it's only in trouble because of me. That's the only reason it's in trouble, because I've placed billions and billions. We've taken in $11 billion worth of taxes that I taxed China. $11 billion. We never made any money with China. We lost money with China. In the last 4 months, we've taken in almost $11 billion of taxes. Nobody's ever heard of that. Nobody knows that. People don't report on that. They only report on nonsense. Nobody ever went to China and said, listen, you're stealing our intellectual property. You're doing all sorts of things that are wrong. You're taking out of our country $500 billion a year, not trillion, not million. You're taking away $500 billion away. You can't do it.
And we're back now with Niger.